First, I'd like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to tell the New Zealand story. So, New Zealand is more than just winning rugby and losing rugby league, it's also dairy farming. And I'll set the scene in terms of the importance of the New Zealand dairy industry because I think Chris Murphy made a very important point that was, what's the why question? Why are we asking about innovation in the private sector and extension? So what I hope to do out of that first point there is say, this is the reason why it's a very important question to ask, and then move on to how the New Zealand dairy industry is sort of tracking in terms of addressing that question, and then conclude with how I think it relates to where the Australian situation is at and try and extend it across sectors. So in one slide, the New Zealand dairy industry is big by New Zealand standards. So it's second only to the tourist industry in terms of export receipts. Therefore, it does get good visibility with politicians, and that's important in the question we're talking about here. At 14 billion income, that's good in terms of on-farm. Employing 35,000 people is good as well. But if you look at the bottom left quadrant there, you see that growth has come at a cost. So a doubling of the industry in 20 years, resulting in more cows than people, has resulted in a substantial environmental footprint. So Tom, environment's mentioned. It's the green bar there is going up with the blue bar, which is growth. And so the tension is the 2020 bar out to the right, which is saying no more increase in environmental footprint. So tell me how you increase profitability while you hold the environmental footprint. Hence the need for private sector extension, research and development to be aligned on this issue. So the argument I'll be making is that we need to be framing our institutional alignments at the scale that really counts for all parties, because the pie is big enough for all parties to play their role. If we do this right, farmers will benefit, the public will be supportive, and we will have an ability to report impact through time. There's another challenge in front of us, and that is debt in the New Zealand situation. So if you look at the yellow segment to the left, it's the largest expense confronting dairy farm businesses now, and so that has implications in terms of options for change, which I'll hit on later. So what I'm trying to do is say that this complexity and the stakes in terms of change are sufficient to grab everyone's interest to put their arm to the wheel and make a difference here. There's no sort of bitching and moaning about, do I release my information here and is the market big enough? So DairyNZ is a little bit like an RDC, but not quite. So it has a strategy and investment function. It also has a fairly substantial operational capability, which is an advantage in part. So there is research and development teams, significant, 90 people working in research, 65 in development. And by development, we're saying these are specialists that package technologies in farmer user ways. And then there's an extension group of about 60 as well that are distributed regionally. In a nutshell, they work on a ratio of about 300 farms per extension agent. Underpinning this, there's policy and marketing that must also be playing its part to set the conditions right when required. And so you see that part of the challenge the New Zealand industry's had has been growth in the south. You can't just turn a tap on and say, okay, we've gone from 7% to 40% of total production out of the South Island when we've doubled production, and think that all the institutional frameworks are in place to support that kind of growth. So part of the comment here is scale of issue, institutional arrangement, and as Lawrence has just said, time frames for change, be realistic about it. So the model that we take, and this is kind of the fourth point I wanted to labour, was to say that we need to start with the farm business, as you've all been saying. Important, start with high quality goals of the farm business. Spend considerable time getting those crystal clear so that when you frame and develop the action plan around that, there's a high chance of it being achieved. So the approach we take is called whole farm assessment. And in a nutshell, we have a discussion group network which gets to about 60%. This is just under 12,000 dairy farms in New Zealand. So 60% of those are reached through that group-based approach. And we really believe there's not much point pushing it beyond that because for various reasons, others are not. This is your segmentation and targeting argument. They just won't engage around group-based work. They're looking for other options, expanding opportunities under social media and so on. Those 60%, they have a host farmer, and so in any one year, slightly under 10% of farm businesses will have action plans that allow us to really focus effort and follow up. So you see down at the bottom there where we talk about referral, that's the rub for us in terms of private sector. How is it that we have a transfer of this argument for change working with the farm business when you have a breakdown in trust between a consulting officer saying, I don't actually believe the consultants in this region are actually up to the mark that I want to hand this bloke over to them. Likewise, the private sector saying, yeah, these guys are just dealing with cows and grass issues, and we know that the really big issue here is actually access to capital and the options the farm business has got. The problem's been framed at the wrong level. The way you get around that is is through partnership. So we roll off this term partnership. I've heard it many times today. What do we really mean by it? That's a snapshot of the partners that DairyNZ deals with. It's mind-boggling to think of the multiple objectives that sit with each of those organisations and why would they want to work with us. And the only way they're going to pull together is if you go back to that why question and say, this is very serious for all of us. There's a reason to be working together around the importance of this issue. We can see our place in terms of doing something about this, and you're providing us a framework to be able to engage and work with you on that. So that framework requires a full systems approach, and it allows the private sector to get a reward for its services, but most importantly, provide the evidence of the reward to the farm business out of the contribution they've made. And we have a thing called Dairy Base, which allows us to benchmark full physical and financials to track that. But it's much more than that. It's putting skin in the game and co-investing. And it's also about getting rid of egos and saying, no one organisation's kind of got the main voice on this. So the partnership approach is really looking at an agreed industry strategy, which means that you bring private sector in at the start to formulate that strategy, and you co-invest. So these are some examples of the co-investment that's coming into DairyNZ and into that dairy industry strategy to pull off that big game. And this was the argument about saying, frame the challenge at the right scale if you really want to get this thing right, as in private sector playing its part with extension. So I want to kind of wrap up with an example. It's got sort of two parts to it, and then what does it mean for Australia? Have we got time for that, Steve? Yeah. Okay, the example is called Dairy Push. This goes back a while, which is great because I can give you a bit of an update on where this has got to. So this is genuine private sector industry good extension working jointly. And it started with the farmers. So a group of farmers came to DairyNZ and said, we want to increase our profitability by 10%. We want you to work with us on it. We pay you a levy, help us out. And we said, yeah, we're probably interested in that as well. You've got some agreements you need to make around this. You need to all benchmark. You need to be using a private sector consultant. you need to be participating in a group, and we'll be documenting this publicly as we go along the way. In a nutshell, probably the key thing to, given time, look at the box on the right-hand side and up a bit. And the little green line at the bottom there is showing that a few ups and downs in the first couple of years, and then consistently banging out what worked out to effectively $50,000 per farm per year profitability out of participation in this when you benchmark them against the regional average. We could do that because we had the dairy-based data across all of them. And so here's the key point. The evaluation at the end went back to the farmers and said, so this cost about $5,000 per farm. You've made 50,000 per annum consistently once the whole thing stabilised. And they said, yep, absolutely agree with all that. So how willing are you to pay for this service? And of course, all of you will be sure of the answer here. So the top payment was $3,000. The average across the group was $1,800 a year. So of course we scratched our heads and said, we're just checking the logic here. So you guys are agreeing you would give away $50,000 a year to save $1,800, is that right? And they said, yep. I said, right, we know that farmers are very bright, and there's a rationale for that, so explain it. And they said, we didn't learn anything new. So what is that telling us about the relationship between the consultant and the farm business and industry good? We do not have sufficient maturity in these partnerships and relationships. Okay, the key thing here is how these consultants were working with those farm businesses. It wasn't about something new in the sense of the latest bit that came out of research and development. The key bit was constant monitoring and the reminder that you agreed to do this, we set up the plan, you know the logic towards your goals, follow through on it. And it was that repeat reminder that nailed the gains. The flip side is Hayden and Alicia Lawrence. So they're farmers in the Taranaki. Now Hayden did his PhD in precision dairy technologies at Massey. The home farm started dropping in performance, so under a lower order share milker, you can see the red line was dropping consistently. Kind of the alarm bells went out. He agreed to go back to the home farm on an equity partnership basis. And he said, right, I'll come in, but we're going to do this my way, Dad. So set in the goals, put in place a program of work, but fully utilised his know-how in partnership with the private sector. So what did that look like? It looked like this. So Ravensdown, sorry, Ian's here from Balance, but Ravensdown the other half. Ravensdown said, we'll play ball with you. So Hayden set up really detailed monitoring, individual cow, paddock monitoring and so on. And as you can see very quickly, that basically saved close to 30 grand a year and made an extra tonne of grass. Private sector agreeing to work closely with the farmer and getting the gains that are entirely consistent in terms of profit and reduced footprint. So our point, in summary, is to say that this is the minimum in terms of the institutional arrangements we think about when we look at innovation and change, extension in the private sector. There's a story around all of these that I don't have time to go into now, but basically our view is you can't get it right without actually thinking of the relationship and the part each one of those players make, and never lose sight of the link between innovation, as we define it there, and the individual business. They all need to gain. So what is it? The key questions that have to be answered each time. What are you doing about the desire for change in terms of the farmer's experience? Their options for change, and remember when they've got very high debt loading, those are shrunk. Their willingness to pay, as we talked about in the dairy push example, and their confidence to change. So as Elke said about professional development, and this is continuous improvement, ongoing professional development is all about building that confidence to change, not just in the farmer, not just in the consultant or the rural professional, in the partnership. And then that leads into the partnership process and the referral process, which say we trust each other to say that yeah, this farm business is going to go to the next step because we're working jointly. I won't go through it now, but DairyNZ's targeted the roles it plays in terms of each of those questions. And the Australian view, take it for what it's worth, but Steve asked for a comment. What does all this mean in terms of Australia? 3 points, I think, in terms of potential problems. So ask yourself, is your institutional alignment fit for the scale of the challenge you've got in front of you? If it is, then you should be able to see that you've got a national priority setting process which nails it. You've got pretty strong government industry agreements, and you know that you're investing at the appropriate scale to pull that off. Have you got confusion in the market? So I wrote this before this morning, so I'd still ask that question from today's discussions. And I can't see how you're going to eliminate that until you have an agreed sort of gold-focused approach. Start with a business, full farm system approach, knowing when you transfer or refer to the private sector through that. And finally, never forget the voluntary contribution you're getting out of the farmers, like Birchip Cropping Group and so on. The importance of the voice from the ground up and making sure that that informs all the way through is vital. Are they always resourced adequately? That's a question.